Hey, RetconRaider here. Today, we're continuing our analysis of Design Document number 14, which covers the sinister ghoul-run settlement known as the Reservation. Last time, we focused on getting a good general overview of the location, so this time, we'll be focused on the numerous NPCs that were planned to appear in and around the reservation. This location is somewhat unusual, because the player was intended to visit it at least twice throughout the game, once during Act 1, and again during Act 2. That means that the challenge level surrounding the reservation was relatively low, but once the player had actually entered the location, they would find that the requirements to progress any further had been drastically increased. To first approach the reservation, the player would need to find a way to at least temporarily overcome the radiation that was surrounding it. They would also have to contend with a small assortment of random encounters, but these were generally designed to be relatively easy for a low-level player to deal with. Monstrous encounters were mostly limited to basic staples of the Fallout setting, such as small nests of mutant roaches or slightly more dangerous rad scorpions. But if the player was particularly unlucky, then they would end up encountering one or more endless walkers. These unfortunate ghouls were exiles from the reservation who had been stripped of their belongings and cast out into the desert for some perceived crime. While most exiles would die soon afterwards, a few would survive long enough to essentially be cooked alive by a combination of constant exposure to both high radiation and the desert sun. Their skin would become hardened like leather, their fingers would wither into dangerous claws, and their brains would fry until they were capable of little more than mindless aggression. Fortunately for the player, Endless Walkers were solitary creatures. Since the area was relatively well traveled, the other random encounters around the reservation were generally restricted to non-hostile NPCs. For example, because the settlement was the center of the local slave trade, it wouldn't be uncommon for the player to randomly encounter slave caravans. These caravans would usually be on their way to the reservation to deliver a fresh batch of slaves, and they would have little interest in the player. While their primary purpose was to give the player an idea of what they were getting themselves into, more altruistic or opportunistic players could approach this as an optional combat encounter. Of course, taking on slavers would be particularly dangerous, but if the player could defeat them, then they would be a rich source of salvage, including environmental suits, assault rifles, and radiation chems. It would also introduce at least one or two new complications that the player would end up having to deal with. First, the player would have to decide what to do with the rescued slaves. They would almost certainly end up dying in the radioactive desert if the player wasn't willing to give them at least some of the equipment they had recovered from the slavers. Second, if too many shipments of slaves started disappearing, then it would hurt the production levels at the reservation, and the ghouls there would start growing increasingly suspicious of strangers. The other NPCs likely to be encountered around the reservation were strange nomadic scavengers known as the Scavin Pickers. Although technically human, these tribals had been changed by constant exposure to the radioactive desert, as well as a crippling addiction to the chems that helped keep them alive. They had developed their own gibberish-like language, and the side effects of their chem addiction made them paranoid and volatile. Although resourceful, the Scavin Pickers were mostly low-tech savages. They primarily equipped themselves with stylized armor made from whatever they could get their hands on, and they generally preferred the use of crude blades, crossbows, and the occasional salvaged gun. They were actually incapable of creating the chems they needed to survive, instead stealing or bartering for them at the reservation. If the player encountered a pack of Scavin Pickers out on the road, then they would initially approach the player peacefully. If the player had learned their language, then this would provide the opportunity for trade, but otherwise the scavengers would quickly turn hostile. Although it was rare, there was also a chance that the player would randomly stumble onto one of the Scavin Pickers' nomadic campsites. The player would have ample opportunity to sneak away, but if they instead decided to investigate, then the scavengers would confront them. Again, the outcome of this confrontation would be resolved based around whether or not the player could understand their language. This is also one of the places where the player could encounter Click, the leader of the Scavin Pickers. We'll get back to her in just a moment. Assuming the player made it to the reservation, they would find themselves relatively unwelcome, and their movements would be restricted to the trading post that was set up just outside the settlement. The ghouls were generally non-hostile, but they were still very rude and dismissive towards humans. While ghouls were usually very weak and frail, the reservation had at least 20 high-level guards. These ghouls were specially trained by Colonel Green, and they were equipped with the finest armor and weaponry that the reservation had to offer, making it very unlikely that the player would survive a physical confrontation. Fortunately, there were at least 1 or 2 friendly faces around the trading post, and one of those faces belonged to Hank. Hank was a relative newcomer to the reservation, but his friendly demeanor and his knowledge about weaponry made him an ideal fit for the settlement's trading post. He didn't seem to share the same deep-rooted hatred for humans that most of the other ghouls possessed, and would make a genuine effort to be friendly and offer the best deals possible. Hank was one of the first friends that the player was likely to make upon arriving at the reservation. He was a ready source of information about the area, and he was also more than happy to teach the player how to communicate with the nomadic scavenge pickers. Hank was an anomaly, because not only had he heard rumors about Dr. Clark's secret plans, but he also strongly disapproved of them. This meant that Hank would be an invaluable ally if the player decided to work against Dr. Clark, though more ruthless players could instead reveal Hank as a dissenter, if they wanted to get on the Doctor's good side. Hank was assisted by a human slave named Gillian McKinley. She was an attractive and surprisingly well-educated woman in her late 30s, who was not only a former member of the Rusty Hooks gang, but also one of the escaped prisoners that the player needed to take back to the Tibbetts prison facility. Under normal circumstances, Gillian would have been used as a test subject in the ghoul procreation experiment, but her education and technical skills made her too valuable to waste. She was instead assigned to work in the trading post as Hank's assistant, and while the ghoul was utterly smitten with her, she wanted nothing more than her freedom so she could go back home. There were numerous ways for the player to secure Gillian's freedom, but we'll get to that in the next video. The other main shop in the trading post was run by Betty, a much less friendly female ghoul who specialized in the sale of leather and metal armors. She had a very low tolerance for humans, bordering on sociopathic, and would handle trade in a very brusque and efficient manner. Part of her constantly dour mood was caused by her unrequited crush on Hank, but she was well aware that Hank himself had an unrequited crush on Gillian. Under normal circumstances, Betty would have just murdered Gillian to get her out of the picture, but the potential threat of exile from the reservation stayed her hand. This was a situation that the player could end up resolving, but it wouldn't do much to improve Betty's attitude. It was simply intended to help point the player towards a potential means of freeing Gillian, so that they could complete the main quest of Act 1. The one other notable ghoul in the trading post was Horatio, who was technically another trader. Horatio was a massive, intimidating ghoul who once served as Dr. Clark's personal bodyguard. When the reservation began buying slaves on a regular basis, the Doctor asked Horatio to handle the slaves, under the assumption that the monstrous ghoul was so terrifying that the slaves would never even think of rebelling against him. Unless the player was selling slaves or knew of a potential source of slaves, Horatio would quickly grow annoyed by their presence, with 2 very notable exceptions. First, if the player was particularly healthy, then Horatio would try to recruit them for use in Dr. Clark's procreation experiments. Of course, he wouldn't actually tell the player what the experiments involved. That was something that the player would find out the hard way. On the other hand, if the player was running a female character with a low charisma attribute, then Horatio would actually end up proposing a more, conventional type of procreation. If the player accepted his advances and also had a high enough endurance skill to keep up with him, then Horatio would end up becoming completely enamored with the player. This was an unconventional but relatively easy way to gain limited access to both the town and Sub-Level 1. Depending on when the player visited the trading post, there was also a chance that they would encounter other notable characters, such as Caius Drusus, a Centurion from Caesar's Legion, or Click, the leader of the scavenge pickers. Centurion Drusus was a slave trader who made monthly deliveries to the reservation. As a Centurion of the Legion, he had a rather inflated opinion of himself, and he would rather bluntly dismiss the player if he was approached. The sole exception would be if the player was working with Trisha, one of the raiders from the Twin Mothers location, in which case Centurion Drusus would end up rewarding the player for pointing him towards another potential source of easily captured slaves. The other regular visitor, Click, was a bit more sociable. She would turn up at the trading post once every 3 days, bothering the other customers and trading with Hank. Although the ghouls generally considered the scavenge pickers to be a nuisance, they were tolerated because they occasionally had good salvage to trade. Much like her followers, Click would approach the player the first time she saw them, greeting them with her tribe's unique brand of gibberish. As long as the player responded politely, then she would be satisfied, moving on to her next victim. If the player could actually understand her, not only would it open the possibility of trade, it would also provide access to a few new side quests. We'll get back to that in the next video. Once the player had found a way into the reservation's shantytown, they would have access to the settlement's average citizens. There were at least 30 generic ghouls living in the settlement, but they generally wouldn't want to have anything to do with the player, with 2 notable exceptions. The first was Florence, the oldest ghoul in the entire settlement. Although she was a member of the original Los Alamos staff, she wasn't a soldier or scientist. Instead, she was a member of the original janitorial staff, who just happened to survive the Great War because she was cleaning one of the bathrooms on Sublevel 1 when the bomb started to fall. She was old and cranky, but also starved for attention, and more than happy to grumble and gossip at the player if they were willing to keep her company. Although she didn't know much about what Dr. Clark was up to, she was still a decent source of information for the player, even providing potential access to the first 2 sublevels. The other notable resident of the shantytown area was Colonel Green. A career soldier before the war, Colonel Green was once in charge of security for the Los Alamos facility. Although he wasn't part of Dr. Clark's hand-picked inner circle, and thus wasn't privy to the Doctor's secret plans, he was still greatly respected by the other ghouls. Colonel Green took his job very seriously, and secretly wished that he was in charge of the entire town. He suspected that Dr. Clark didn't have the reservation's best interests at heart, and would eagerly take advantage of any excuse to depose the Doctor and claim control of the settlement for himself. If the player could suitably impress Colonel Green, then he would recruit them as a double agent, providing them with easier access to the restricted areas, as well as significant combat support during the final confrontation with the Doctor. Although they both lived on Sublevel 3, it was also possible for the player to meet Belle and Measles around the shantytown area. We've talked about Measles before. He was the first and oldest of the 4 born ghouls, and the most loyal of Dr. Clark's followers. At a glance, he looked no different from any other ghoul, and he deliberately played up to this expectation by acting weak and frail, but in truth, he was deceptively strong, fast, and vicious. His appearance was curiously symmetrical for a ghoul, belying some strange purpose to his numerous scabs, lesions, and exposed bits of bone. His most striking feature were the 2 bulbous tumors on his neck, which, combined with his morbid fascination for childhood diseases, was the source of his unusual name. Although he acted as Dr. Clark's personal bodyguard, he also acted as the Doctor's eyes and ears around the reservation. As the player completed quests around the settlement, it was very likely that Measles would end up taking an interest in them, eventually trying to recruit them to help further Dr. Clark's goals. Of course, given his duplicitous nature, Measles wouldn't necessarily let the player know what they were actually working towards. It was far more likely that Measles would join the player as a potential ally, only to betray them at a later point in time. We'll be talking about that in the next video. The other born ghoul that the player could meet around town was Belle, the youngest and most unusual of Dr. Sebastian's creations. Created in 2251, she was the only female-born ghoul, and she was easily the most beautiful ghoul in existence. Although there were still telltale signs of her ghoulish nature, such as symmetrical lesions and exposed bone, she otherwise resembled a pale but attractive human woman. She was a willing participant in the procreation experiments, sleeping with other ghoul volunteers in hopes that it might make her pregnant. If the player happened to be running a male character with low charisma, then Belle would end up shamelessly and aggressively flirting with them. If the player accepted her advances and had a high enough endurance to keep up with her, then she would end up becoming smitten with them. This would have some rather significant results. First, it would give the player ready access to Sublevel 1, which is where the private, meetings would take place. If she also ended up falling in love with the player, then she would be a valuable source of information about Dr. Clark's plans, possibly even providing the player with a keycard to Sublevel 3. It would also result in Belle becoming pregnant, marking the first known ghoul pregnancy and leading to a special end slide about the player's child. If this occurred, then Belle would end up sitting out the final confrontation with Dr. Clark, unwilling to risk the life of her unborn child. Once the player had access to Sub-Level 1, they would begin meeting some of the more competent, specialized ghouls, such as Marty. Marty was one of the resident chemists who used the chemical lab on Sub-Level 2 to create the chems that they needed to keep their human slaves alive. He also used the lab to secretly manufacture Smooch, a potent new chem. This substance could be smoked or consumed to provide a soothing, mellow sensation in ghouls, and a dangerously addictive sensation of ecstasy in humans. If the player proved willing, then Marty would work with them to start selling his new chem in nearby human settlements. It's also important to note that Marty was one of the 2 quiet dissenters on the reservation, and another potential ally against Dr. Clark. Although he hadn't heard any specifics of the Doctor's plans, he had heard both rumors and the screams of agonized test subjects, and he didn't much care for either of them. Much like with Hank, this was something that the player could use to their advantage. But again, we'll come back to that in the next video. If the player gained access to Sub-Level 2, then they would also be able to meet with another potential ally, Fred the Slave. While most of the human slaves who came to the reservation died soon afterwards, Fred was one of the very rare exceptions. Not only had he survived the hellish work conditions, but he had actually ended up thriving. Physically powerful and imposing, he had earned the grudging respect of the other ghouls, to the point where any ghoul caught mistreating Fred would be severely punished. While Fred played the part of an ideal slave, his spirit remained unbroken, and he would try to approach the player soon after they first arrived on Sub-Level 2. If the player could somehow earn Fred's trust, then he was another valuable ally, with the ability to mobilize the slaves against their oppressors. The only other notable NPC on Sub-Level 2 was Milt the Foreman, who supervised the weapon and ammo assembly lines. Milt was a former raider who first came to the reservation after the rest of his gang was wiped out. As the former gunsmith for his gang, he was quickly assigned to work on Sub-Level 2. A relative newcomer to the settlement, Milt wasn't really interested in getting involved with local politics or power struggles. He just wanted to do his job. He would help the player find their way around if they had permission to be on Sub-Level 2, but that was about it. That finally brings us to Sub-Level 3, the nerve center of the entire reservation. We've already talked about Belle and Measles, so that just leaves Dr. Sebastian, Dr. Willem Clark, and the 2 other unnamed born ghouls. Curiously, aside from Belle and Measles, the other 2 born ghouls weren't given a name or any significant description, which appears to be an intentional decision on the part of the document's writer. Their intended role in the game was simply to serve as powerful enemies during the player's inevitable confrontation with Dr. Clark. If the born ghouls somehow survived this final confrontation, then they would later appear in special scripted encounters to get their revenge on the player. While there were other elite scientists stationed on Sub-Level 3, the only one of importance, aside from Dr. Clark himself, was Dr. Sebastian. This ghoul was monstrous in both body and mind, and he acted as the primary driving force behind Dr. Clark's hideous human experimentation. A former plastic surgeon before the war, Dr. Clark first met Sebastian during his expedition in 2087. Already a ghoul at the time, Sebastian was skinning a dead human in hopes that he could use it to obscure his own decaying body. Dr. Clark convinced him to instead embrace his new condition, forever earning the surgeon's fanatical loyalty. Like his mentor, Dr. Sebastian is single-minded to the point of obsession. He would happily continue to butcher human test subjects for the rest of his life, as long as it continued to get results. Unless the player decided to support Dr. Clark's vision, Dr. Sebastian would have to be killed. That brings us to Dr. Willem Clark. He was the project leader at the Los Alamos labs back before the war, gifted with both a brilliant mind and incredible leadership abilities. When the Great War took place, it was Dr. Clark who rallied as many of the staff members as he could, leading them to the relative safety of the sublevels. We talked about this back in the first video. The bombs ended up breaching Sub-Level 2, exposing the survivors to a steady flow of radiation, and within 10 years, all but 24 of them had perished. The few remaining survivors had all been transformed into ghouls, but Dr. Clark took this in stride, assuming that everyone else who had survived the war had been similarly changed. In 2087, Dr. Clark once again took charge, unsealing the sublevels and leading an expedition into the wastelands in search of other survivors. The expedition did not go well, and all of the other volunteers were killed, but the Doctor returned 1 year later with roughly 30 other ghouls he had encountered in the wastelands. Dr. Clark had witnessed how humanity treated their ghoul brethren, and he had become convinced that ghouls were the next logical step in human evolution. He began preaching that humanity's time had passed, and that now it was time for ghouls to inherit the Earth. Most of the other ghouls on the reservation rallied to his new cause, and he was once again put in charge of the fledgling settlement. He spent the centuries afterwards working with Dr. Sebastian to improve their species, while also secretly preparing for an inevitable war with the human race. All the while, he was being practically worshipped by his new followers, and eventually he let it go to his head. He became increasingly reclusive, eventually sealing himself into Sublevel 3 with only his most devout and loyal followers surrounding him. Although he was still brilliant, he began speaking in the third person and structured his speech in a way that made it sound more like scripture. By the time the player would meet him, Dr. Clark would only communicate through a video screen, and even then with only his mouth showing, for fear that anyone who met his gaze might be burned by his magnificence. By 2053, Dr. Clark firmly believed himself to be the destined savior of his species, and he would go to any measure, no matter how monstrous or depraved, to make certain that this happened. Unfortunately, as brilliant as he was, his madness and ambition would ultimately lead to the complete and utter destruction of the reservation and everyone in it. But of course, that's a subject for another video. For now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can check out most of the leaked materials for yourself by visiting the fan-run wikis. Links are in the description.